The many monsters of Little Nightmares have always been among the most intriguing and iconic elements of the franchise, and for good reason. With uniquely disturbing appearances, attributes, behaviors, and entire areas carefully designed around these traits, each one is highly memorable and remains a big point of interest for discussion and speculation. Officially, they are known as residents, a term that refers to people who live somewhere permanently or on a long-term basis. In this case, Nowhere, a dark realm that entraps children from the waking world within their own nightmares. Children who are in turn known as visitors, since they don't belong here. Considering the sheer number of residents that have been introduced in the franchise to this point and how important they are to the stories being told, I wanted to take some time and address the big question that every discussion of these creatures invariably leads to. Where do they come from? This is a pretty complicated topic without an obvious answer, so I decided to structure this video a bit differently than usual. To start, I'll be presenting 3 possible theories for where the residents come from, discussing the evidence for and arguments against each one, and after that I'll offer my own personal theory that tries to make sense of it all. As per usual, this video will contain spoilers for every Little Nightmares game as well as the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, so I would highly recommend experiencing them yourself before watching any further. And so we begin with option number 1. The residents are manifestations, or in other words, children's warped perceptions of adults and other abusers come to life. This is the oldest and most basic answer. Since Nowhere is a place where children's nightmares coalesce into reality, a grim world that stands as a dark reflection of our own, it would make a lot of sense for the monsters who reside there to also be born of children's trauma and fear. In a revealing interview with Gaming Bible back in 2021, Dave Mervick, Tarzier's senior narrative designer, said the following: "This is a world that takes real experiences and twists them into unfamiliar shapes, so what they have become here is as important as what they were." It's pretty easy to see what some of those real experiences might have been. What's worse than a strict, uncompromising teacher who seems to have eyes in the back of her head, who can see everything you do? How about one who can literally stretch her neck across the room? What's worse than dealing with a school bully? How about attending a school with only bullies? We must also consider children who are afraid of doctors and their cold, sterile offices, or those who have had traumatic experiences within hospital care. Children who desperately want the attention of their distracted and disinterested parents but are forever left to their own devices. Children who are creeped out by taxidermy and the dead, glassy eyes of its victims, or those who find mannequins distinctly unnerving, wondering if they are going to move when you aren't looking. These are all reasonable and relatable fears, and looking at the world through this lens of dream logic is a pretty intuitive way to understand it. But some questions remain. For instance, you could argue that as monstrous as the residents might be, they are nonetheless alive and intelligent to some degree, even possessing some kind of soul or life essence that can be drained from their bodies. They feel human, with their own desires, fears, and general sense of self-awareness, all of which suggest that they are more than just fabrications within a dream. We also have to ask, why would children collectively be afraid of a geisha, a television host, a butler, or a granny? This manifestation theory would seem to explain some residents well, but not others, so let's move on to option number 2. The residents are children who survived long enough to grow up and become adults. Now, we already know this to be true in some cases. At the end of Little Nightmares 2, Mono grows up to become the Thin Man, and 6 also transforms into a monster likely due to time dilation occurring within the signal tower. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, as clues from all across Nowhere hint that this could be a universal pattern. Starting at the hunter's cabin, we can see that one of the stuffed humans set around the dining table appears to be younger than the others. A teenager by the looks of it, smaller than the host of adult viewers in the Pale City, but still much larger than Mono and 6. This implies there might be a middle stage between child and adult in this world, a possibility that was later confirmed to be true by the podcast. In Chapter 4, Noon runs into a group of teenagers at the carnival and observes that from the way they looked, they'd been there a long time. Rusty explains that he and the others are children who glowed under the spotlight while others shriveled into shadows, and they are now forced to perform in the big tent by the man in the purple suit. Likewise, in Chapter 5, Noon sees a man with a swollen head and metal detector who trudges through the sewer grime to find trinkets dropped from the world above, and makes this interesting observation.
But I could tell he was not always that way. He'd changed, somehow become one with the sewers.
Considering how many children live just above the sewers, it would make sense for this resident to have once been a child himself. A child who became lost in the wet underground tunnels but somehow managed to survive, adapting to the harsh environment and eventually mutating into this grotesque being. Finally, in Chapter 6, Noon looks through a wooden chest in the puppeteer's workshop and finds several child-sized outfits within, including a yellow raincoat, a tan trench coat, and a doctor's coat. The size of these first two outfits makes sense, belonging to Six and Mono respectively, but it's a little odd for the doctor's coat to be small when the actual doctor is anything but. Perhaps this is hinting that he was once a small child as well, one who had changed, somehow becoming one with the hospital. Further evidence for this theory can be found even beyond the games and podcast, like in these official social media posts from 2020 and 2021. The first reads, "Your inner child is the only thing standing between you and life as a resident." And the second, "No one in that world dares face what they've become." Though admittedly quite vague, you could interpret these lines to mean that children who become trapped in nowhere grow up once they've let go of their inner child, embracing the darkness and being gradually stripped of their humanity. There's one really big problem with this explanation, however, and a compelling counterargument to go with it. There are a lot of residents in Nowhere, and while it's true that plenty of children end up here, the mortality rate of these children is extremely high. Whether they end up in the Maw, the Pale City, the Nest, or anywhere else, chances are they are going to die quickly, and it just doesn't seem sustainable for the population of residents to be fully replenished by new children, especially when many of them don't seem to last very long either. We also have cases like the family in the Hunter's Cabin and the couple who appear in Episode 5 of the digital comics. Are we really supposed to believe that children grow into horrifying monsters and then get married? Start families? Finally, for what it's worth, the official description of the twin chefs says that they were born to be chefs, which would be kind of a weird thing to say about normal children. There must be more going on here, which brings us to option number 3. The residents are adults who cross over into Nowhere. This idea is straight up confirmed by a Little Nightmares 2 pre-release booklet given to members of the press, which says that the game takes place somewhere born out of people's worst impulses. A place where the worst from the real world are reborn as a grotesque version of themselves, continuing their descent into darkness. Which is cool and all, but personally I don't think this is canon. It's way too obscure and was obviously written before the game was finalized, since it also says there would be 6 levels when only 5 made it into the full release. A better source for this theory is the current Little Nightmares website. In the official description for the first game, the guests are described as being corrupted souls, which implies that not only do they have souls, but that there was something moral about them to be corrupted in the first place. More importantly, in the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, we learn that it is possible for adults to cross the threshold and enter Nowhere, though in what manner and form is unclear. Let's listen to the exchange between Otto and the ferryman at the end of Chapter 6.
The counselor. He wants to come.
Too long in the tooth. I feed the spectrum's other end.
I earned this. All my life I've waited. Let me cross, ferryman. You hear me? Invite me to your...
Otto says,
A toe dipped, but to plunge you must be pushed.
How do I enter? I need to know. Tell me how to cross, tell me.
A quarter will be granted. The toll set in torments, not yet paid.
Let's break this down line by line. Too long in the tooth. I feed the spectrum's other end. Otto cannot come with Noon because he is too old, and the ferryman only deals with children. A toe dipped, but to plunge, you must be pushed. Otto has glimpsed what lies beyond the threshold, but in order to cross it himself, he needs to be pushed by some force. A quarter will be granted, the toll set in torments not yet paid. To grant a quarter means to offer someone shelter, either temporary or permanent. To give them residency. But first, Otto will need to pay his way in torments. Though not confirmed, it is definitely implied that this means sending more children to Nowhere, driving them into the realm by his selfish, obsessive behavior. Perhaps this is how every adult gets there. A sadistic teacher who terrorized her students. A malpracticing doctor who took advantage of his patients, experimenting on them in dangerous ways. Or thoughtless, uncaring parents who neglected their children for the sake of their own interests. These adults who have caused great torment to children and knowingly or unknowingly sent them into the clutches of nowhere become eligible for a one-way ticket there themselves, and I believe that the push the ferryman speaks of is death. Upon reaching their mortal end, the souls of these individuals are pulled across the threshold and reincarnated as residents in that realm, existing in a kind of purgatory. Interpreted this way, it feels quite reminiscent of Dante's Inferno, a famous Italian poem that follows Dante as he journeys through the 9 circles of hell, each one representing a type of sin and the corresponding punishment. Gluttony, greed, anger, and so forth, with the outermost circle being limbo itself. There are some obvious parallels to be drawn here, like the maw being the very epitome of gluttony, but I don't think trying to make a one-to-one comparison is all that productive. Instead, I want to focus on the potential link between residence and sin because we find good evidence to back this up in the podcast. You're probably aware that Chapter 2 was written by Super Horror Bro, and in a video explaining how he came up with the idea for the bathhouse and the filthy residents we find there, he says the following. Everyone within this particular nightmare is a sort of humanoid creature desperately looking to keep clean, but because of their sinful actions, they're forever filthy in this place. They're always trying to get clean, but they never can, and continue to prey on anyone else around them. These beings are self-aware and despise themselves, feeling the weight of the torments they've inflicted and desperate for suds to cleanse their profane skin, but cannot change their utterly selfish ways. Here in Nowhere, it is far, far too late, and I think one of the reasons for this is that they are no longer their complete selves. In an interview with Eurogamer in 2019, Dave Mervick made this interesting remark. All of the residents of Little Nightmares don't really have motivations, it's like id. It's the base instinct of people. They don't have a goal in life that they want to achieve, it's just this urge. So, a place where people are condemned and trapped by the primal urges that dominated their behavior in life? Dante would like a word. Overall, the evidence for this explanation is pretty solid, but there are still some big question marks. We just don't know enough about the threshold to say for certain this is how it works. It also sounds difficult for adults to cross, and as established earlier, there are a vast number of residents to account for. Finally, for this to be true, humans must have souls, which then begs the question, where do these souls go if not into nowhere? That last question is far beyond the scope of this video, but regardless, I do think there's a good way to reconcile these 3 different theories. Simply, all of them are true. The discussion around residents tends to get muddy because we treat them all as being the same, when really that may not be the case at all. In fact, I think we can classify the residents of Nowhere into 4 different tiers, each with their own characteristics and origin. First up are the Keepers. These are children who become living vessels of dark power, seizing it when given the opportunity and then growing into adults, with immense control over a large geographic area and all other residents within it. Their primary purpose is to maintain a large living structure, keeping them well fed and well entertained, as we see the lady do for the maw and the thin man do for the signal tower. I also think this could be the case for the prison warden in Chapter 1 of the podcast, from whom we get the word keeper. The world of Nowhere is truly as wide as the deep, but narrow as the well, and these are the children who descended to the very bottom. The next group are those I've decided to call greater residents. Like the Keepers, they exert control over a specific territory and those who inhabit it, but these tend to be much smaller in scale. Think the janitor and twin chefs of the Maw, the craftsman and butler of the Nest, the hunter, doctor, and teacher of the Pale City, and the collector of the sewers. I suspect that the lady in charge of the factory and the man in the purple suit might fit into this tier as well, but they could also be Keepers since their domains appear to be quite large. Another defining trait of greater residents is that many of them have unique abilities, like extra long or stretchy limbs, telekinesis, or more general defiance of gravity, but you'll notice that none seem to possess the same dark power wielded by the Keepers. That is the key distinction. These are also children who survived long enough to grow up and become twisted, warped, changed by Nowhere, but without ever joining themselves to a living structure. This brings us to Tier 3, the lesser residents. Those who lack power and identity, and most importantly, come in very large numbers. This group includes the guests of the Maw, patrons of the bathhouse, viewers of the Pale City, spectators of the carnival, workers of the factory, and maybe the dwellers of the necropolis. These residents are adults who crossed over, who were reborn into Nowhere, and that is why they are so numerous. I said earlier that it is difficult for adults to enter the realm, but really, all we know for sure is that it is difficult for Otto to enter, and there's an easy explanation for that. While children travel to nowhere in their innocence and eventually become monsters, this process is reversed for adults, who must become a monster first and are then able to enter in their corruption and guilt. When the story of the podcast begins, the counselor is a decent person genuinely concerned with helping the children in his care, and in each episode we see him grow progressively more selfish, callous, and obsessive, until finally pushing Noon over the threshold. He is well on his way to becoming a monster, but still has plenty of room to fall further. Residency is reserved for the worst humanity has to offer, a reward for those who feed the eyes well, and it's not hard to imagine countless other adults doing this without having any knowledge of nowhere at all. They live despicable, destructive lives and are subsequently claimed by this dark realm, becoming hollow imitations of their former selves with only faint memories of who they were before, now at the mercy of the very children they cast away. A fitting irony indeed. All of the residents discussed so far differ from each other in significant ways, but there is one important detail that they share in common. All of them are thoroughly human, both in their identities and in the monstrous forms they take, forms that are surely influenced or manifested to some extent by the nightmares of countless children in the waking world. But this is not true of the fourth and final tier, the natives. These residents are decidedly inhuman, alien beings that work to keep the realm functioning, with powers and motives that are barely understood. The most prominent example is, of course, the ferryman. In Chapter 1 of the podcast, Noon asserts that he doesn't belong to our world, and later in Chapter 5, Otto theorizes that the ferryman is the source of the guardian at the threshold archetype that appears in the stories of innumerable cultures, a being who has dealt with the human race for millennia. Other residents that I believe fit into this tier include the North Wind, the Mirror Monster, and maybe the Puppeteer from Chapter 6, as explained in my breakdown of the Workshop Dream. So those are the 4 tiers, and while the vast majority of residents can be neatly classified into one of them, there are some notable exceptions that I want to address, starting with the Pretender. At first glance, this little resident would appear to be the keeper of the nest. She has great power and is able to vanish the bodies of those she touches, much like the Signal Tower and Thin Man do to the viewers, and has loyal servants who cater to her every whim and handle the upkeep of the Clifftop Mansion, much like the janitor and chefs do for the Lady of the Maw. But this assessment doesn't really hold up to closer inspection. High above the entryway, we find a portrait of the Pretender standing at the feet of 2 adults, presumably her parents, which implies that she may not be in charge of the nest after all, and this is further supported by her name, Pretender, or one who claims or aspires to a title or position. She is no keeper, but is instead pretending to be one, having been inspired by and trying to emulate the Lady of the Maw. It is no coincidence that a portrait on the ground level depicts the Pretender standing before the shadows of other children, just like the one we see of the lady, or that a book about the Maw can be seen in the playroom. The great ship and its keeper are evidently well known across nowhere. She might also be inspired by the Thin Man, as elsewhere in the room a tall figure has been drawn, and the nest has its fair share of televisions. I think the Pretender is no more than a greater resident, albeit one who has not quite grown up yet, and is being humored by the actual keeper of the nest for some unknown reason. Perhaps maintaining this semblance of a family unit is an important part of keeping the mansion satisfied. Next up is the Granny. Based on her intelligence, unique ability to breathe underwater, and control within a specific domain, she would appear to be a greater resident. But once again, this initial assumption doesn't really hold up to closer inspection. There are no residents down here to exert control over, and more importantly, the Granny is actually a prisoner herself, trapped in the flooded bowels of the Maw and reliant on scraps of food dropped from above to survive. While theories regarding her origin vary greatly, I personally believe the Granny to be the previous Lady of the Maw, or Number 4, who was attacked by the Child 5 and had her dark power siphoned away. Following this violent encounter, she was unceremoniously cast into the depths, a keeper overthrown. This tracks with the Granny's official description, which states that she was abandoned to decay and rage and will let no one go. Decay because she was torn from her mirrors and masks and brushes and unable to hide her true hideous appearance. Rage because all of her power and authority was stolen. And her fixation on catching the children who stumble into her waters might stem from the trauma of being torn away from her collection of dolls. At this point, let's move over to the Pale City and discuss the bullies. Now this is an interesting case. On the surface, they appear to have much in common with lesser residents. They are plentiful, homogeneous, and driven by instinct. But at the same time, they are quite intelligent, they are children, and they are also made out of clay. So what's going on here? I think the bully's origin is revealed in the science lab, a section of the school that is filled with glass jars containing various preserved organs. In one room, the teacher can be seen putting together a human anatomy model, carefully placing each real organ into its proper position within a suspiciously organic-looking torso. Why does the teacher need to understand anatomy, and more importantly, why do we need to know that she understands it? I believe that when the teacher catches children within her domain, she seeks to add them to her class, transplanting their organs into clay bodies. But she leaves out something very important: their brains. To become her obedient pupils, they mustn't retain any identity or knowledge from their previous lives, and so these dangerous organs are stored up on the highest shelves, far out of their reach. Continuing this line of thought, isn't it interesting that we see plenty of broken heads, but no broken bodies? As for how the bullies can still think and act without a brain, we need to look no further than the individual serving detention: the transmission. This powerful signal is omnipresent throughout the Pale City, easily passing through the walls of the school and resonating within the students' hollow heads, filling them with a warped vision of what a human child should be. To be clear, this is only a theory, and you could well argue against it. The anatomy model is far bigger than that of a bully, after all, and there is no indication that the school has a section dedicated to pottery. But Little Nightmares is well known for implying gruesome fates rather than showing them, so I don't think we can rule this explanation out entirely, and in any case, I'm going to say the bullies don't belong in any of the 4 tiers and instead fall into the same category as gnomes and shadow children. They are not residents, but instead the remnants of visitors. The final resident of significance who doesn't seem to fit into any of these tiers is Monster Baby, who is far larger than any of the others, closer in size to a building than a human. Surely no child could grow into this, or adult be reborn into it. And I don't think that's the case. Rather, the baby is actually a living structure belonging to a group of native residents only briefly alluded to earlier: the eyes themselves. These twisting, writhing masses of flesh and eyeballs are the most important residents of all, the very foundation of nowhere, and the reason why children and adults are brought over into this world in the first place. For the eyes feast upon fear and flesh alike, and humanity provides an endless supply of both. So there you have it, my best explanation for where the residents come from, and if you enjoyed the video, then be sure to hit the like button down below and consider subscribing to the channel for many more theories to come. As is the case with all things in Little Nightmares, our understanding will continue to evolve as new information is revealed, and I expect we'll learn plenty more about Nowhere's unsavory denizens in Little Nightmares 3 and the newly revealed Descent to Nowhere comic series. In the meantime, I hope you found this explanation useful for understanding the residents in a new way. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.